I'm talking about today is really inspired from challenges I've met in the language classroom, particularly in French. But also, I think we see similar things in English. I'm really inspired and definitely a part of the Flagstaff School in considering register differences. This work also came out of a work that I did in a course with Dr. Randy Reppin. And so this is, we're all connected here, but this is maybe a very different way of looking, of using these approaches to look at something new. When I wanted to look more into descriptive work in French, I found that there's not a whole lot. In general, there are corpus linguists. There's work being done in French language, of course, but it's a very different approach to what I'm accustomed with in Flagstaff. And being a teacher at the same point in time, I wanted to really investigate two really key features, two sequences that I think are really helpful for beginner students, but also maybe enlightening for more advanced learners. I will stop a couple of times during this to take questions. I see we still have some questions left over from last time, so I'll try to kind of weed through which ones are more relevant to this one. Our good old Ant Conch, I loaded up a pre-made corpus in spoken French, and I was trying to figure out what are the common n-grams, what are the common sequences here that we would encounter in spoken French in particular, because we know quite a bit about written French, and it came up with these chunks of words and expressions that are really common. However, out of the top 25, 24 had to do with two sequences, one being 𝗬 and the other one being 𝗟𝗑, or variations thereof with different morphology. And so just for those of you who are non-French speakers, a quick introduction to French, the expression 𝗟𝗑, three separate words, but together means there is or there are, kind of the existential meaning. It can also be used in a temporal sense for a go. And it can be modified in a number of ways through the tense and through negation and adverbs of negation as well. So we have lots of different possibilities for this to appear. 𝗬, it just means it is. And there are also singular plural forms. There's different tenses of this, of course, and negation and adverbs of negation that can be used with this to modify it. And so, being two really fundamental phrases, I was kind of excited to see in spoken French how important these phrases were that I ended up teaching in my first year course, and why and how kind of they are used and how they vary throughout the spoken register as well. So looking at the literature a little bit, we do know quite a bit about existentials in English, and in general, they're typically used to introduce new information. However, that's not the whole story. So we see also there plus be constructions don't always introduce new information, and they're used differently across registers. And this is particularly in English. They're messy in spoken language. So we get some naturally produced language like this. Well, there is other things they do not. That they do, you want on special. That's hard for me to read, actually. There is other things they do, you want on special, right? Some might argue it should be there are. However, this is a naturally produced example, potentially an error. But still, these constructions can be really complex and messy. In linguistics, especially looking in French linguistics, there's a lot of research in cleft constructions. And in corpus linguistics, there's been a kind of a continuation of that research in cleft constructions because they're complex. And I think they're kind of interesting in that they occur differently in French than they do in English, and potentially in other Latin languages too. So for example, il y avait un monsieur qui venait accorder le piano. There was a man who was coming, right? So we always have sort of a who or that or what in these constructions. Lots of functional analyses of these in corpus linguistics as well. So interesting. In learner corpora, we also have some research about how 𝗬 is used, but not necessarily 𝗬𝗑. And we don't really see it addressed in kind of the more academic lexical bundle research at this time. So backing up and putting myself back into my teacher's shoes, and I was looking at how is this being presented in textbooks. And so here's the excerpt of the first time my students are introduced to 𝗬𝗑. And of course, this textbook is created for North American learners, so it gives the English equivalent here. And here's an example, il y a un problème au lycée. Here's where it really dives into how nouns work and how you put nouns together with this as well. So very kind of implicitly taught here. It doesn't really, it gives the equivalent, but it doesn't really say you have to use it this way or those sorts of things. However, all of the examples for both the expression 𝗬𝗑 and 𝗬 are fairly simple, and that they typically are put together with a noun and a determiner, an indefinite article, in this case, before them. French does not have the null indefinite article for some, so you have to use des in this case. So my study was to look at to what extent do these vary in a couple of registers, and what's the context around them, particularly what happens after these expressions and their variations. So I'm going to look at this through a couple of different ways, and I used two different corpora to represent two different registers. So the first one were two pre-collected, assembled, available corpora, the 𝗃𝗏 and the 𝗃𝗶𝗃𝗏. Both of these have to do with interviews and conversations that are collected and transcribed from roughly the 1980s into the 2000s. So it's relatively modern, kind of early internet era. So we see kind of maybe a little bit of a difference there. Putting these two corpora together resulted in 560 texts, predefined texts, as in one text would be a conversation, and just under 2 million words. Now, I have come to learn that a lot of French teachers across the world are kind of trained in and through the lens of literature. So I thought, why not look at what spoken language looks like in literature? So it was kind of my motivation for this other corpus to use as a comparison. So I'm calling this the QFFL, quotes from French literature. And I used the freely available books in Project Gutenberg. So all 19th century as well, which is a commonly studied era of literature. 1829 to 1887 is what I came up with in terms of the top 35 titles. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these authors, such as Hugo, Balzac de Maupassant, Dumas, Flaubert, and Jules Verne, titles that are internationally celebrated and famous, and probably you've read at least, or heard of, or watched the film version of at least a few of these. So I ended up with 17 titles of the 35 that had qualifying quoted speech chunks that I could treat as kind of a conversation, which was about 600 texts, but it was about 880,000 words. So kind of shorter texts in this case. Because I know we have quite a few corpus linguists here with us today, I want to kind of show my process for building this corpus in Python. As mentioned, I have a background in computer programming for financial firms and data management, but I've never used Python before I started this project. So I had to kind of learn the new syntax and the new language here. But if you're familiar with any sort of programming language, I think you can kind of see how we're using variables, how we're using these structures to do this. I am not an expert in Python. I'm not an expert in computer programming either. I mostly learned through tutorials and trying things and kind of experimenting and seeing what works, double checking, triple checking, and then doing it again. So there are a lot of easier ways to do what I'm about to present. And so keep that in mind as we go through this. But I think what's important is for the concepts that you're interested in investigating, this is at least one way you can go about doing that. The process was to use the Python script to read the files, break them into chunks. And what I mean by that, and in a different language, when we have kind of multiple chunks of strings of texts or even numbers, we can do a process called exploding. And what that means is you take this one long string and you take a lot of information put together and you break it apart in a way that you can manage in different ways. And so I was exploding in a couple different ways, or splitting these things in a couple different ways. I ran quickly into the problem of quotations in French literature, which has two different systems, which we have the 𝗬𝗍𝗍, which is this double figure right here. And occasionally we have just this dash dash with the short dash system as well. I read through all of the books that I selected and made sure that there was not yet another third quotation system. Everything fell into these two systems right here. So I generally looked for dialogue with 2 or more lines in a row. And then I encapsulated, so made a tag out of any non-spoken fragments within that. And I'll show how I did that. So just thinking about words that had said, responded, exclaimed, etc. And then I wrote out each one of those to a new file. So the common process I did with this, let's look at an example first. So here's the original, here's the translation, and in just a second, I'll show you how I was able to encapsulate these separately. So, mauvais coup, parlez-nous du 𝗟𝗔𝗘𝗟 𝗪𝗲. So here we have 𝗵cie voided. However, in the French version, we don't have any separate punctuation to work with in terms of which part is representing speech and which part is the written part. So said the 𝗟𝗔𝗘𝗟 𝗪𝗲. Je réclame mon enjeu repris sur Thomas 𝗪𝗂𝗏. And so we have the rest of this as well, that kind of goes back and forth really seamlessly in French without punctuation to represent this speech and other parts that are not spoken. So the result of this was to encapsulate off these other sections. And when there were long sections, the code rejected those entirely. So I could make more of a smooth flowing conversation here as well. And with this, I was able to search through text that had kind of what was represented as spoken language much more than anything else. So I did this through a process of loops or nested loops. And so I created a loop that one process of that loop would look at a book, and that would repeat for each book. The next one would look at each paragraph in each book, right? And some of these are 500 pages long, so we have a lot of paragraphs to parse through here. And then I looked at each phrase, is what I'm calling. I don't really like this term, but this chunk of language that is between 2 punctuation points. And this is where I really had to be careful about separating out which parts were actually spoken and which parts were kind of reported part. So here's what the code looks like. If you're intimidated by code, I'll walk through this slowly. I think it's more important that you get the concept of what's going on here rather than the details. The syntax is something you have to try, and you'll make errors, but with a programming suite like PyCharm, which is what I use, that is free, completely free, there are also lots of hints and ways to help you through this. So we set up our system by being able to write to the operating system and being able to use regular expressions. And I think a lot of people are familiar with regular expressions if you work in Corpus. If you're still frightened by them, like I am slightly when I'm trying to figure out something really complex, there are some ways to get some help with that. And it's really, for me, it's still a process of trial and error, and you just try and try, and then you find something that works. I set up a few variables in the beginning just to kind of work with throughout this, and then I'll show you how they work. This is a loop, so it's called a for loop. And so for each file, I check to make sure it actually has a txt file, just in case there's other stuff in there. If it is, then I give it a number. And then I open it as an in file. So I read that text into this, and there's a couple of different ways you can do this. Like I said, I'm not a Python expert, so there's more or less efficient ways of working through this with different commands and different options here. But this is what I end up going with, and it worked well for this size of corpus. If you have a larger corpus, you really have to consider carefully about the efficiency of the code. So these are regular expressions, and they're kind of frightening looking. They might look like an alien code to you now. Basically, this is saying for any characters between these 2 points, which is my tag code for the introduction information from Project Gutenberg, or I would often do this for the prelude of something if there's no conversation in that, because it's not really a part of the main text. So I would pull those out and just say, forget those in consideration for the rest of this. Here, I would look at any punctuation, period or an exclamation point. And later on, I'll look at this again in a different way and add line breaks to them. So we're doing a lot with our what's called string manipulation. We're really diving in and kind of adding spaces in certain places. We're kind of forgetting certain parts that we don't think are important for the conversation part that we want to extract. And then here's the key part. We split this. So for each book, I'm actually splitting, I call a paragraph, but it's anything that ends with 2 line breaks or an exclamation point or a period. So really we're looking more like sentences in this case. And then within that, I'm looking for these 2 markers that I set up as the quoted speech, the beginning of the quoted speech. If I find these markers, I set a flag for this loop. So I tell this loop, hey, we need to start an output file because it looks like it might be the beginning of a conversation. It has a quote in it. And then throughout here, I also added some extra spaces for each one of these punctuation marks. And I wanted to do that so when I went in to look at it, it looked like a conversation, right? There were kind of lines between the conversation pieces, the interlocutors in the text. Like I mentioned, regular expressions can be a little frightening. I came across this website, which is fantastic, called regexr.com, and it gives you explanations and helps you build your regular expressions if you're unfamiliar with that. Of course, you don't even need to use programming. You can do this with AntConc or a lot of the other concordance programs out there. This was a bottom-up process of going through and looking at all of these lines and seeing which ones had the words that we don't want to be included, that would have reported speech in them, such as said, responded, exclaimed, was saying, asked, etc. And so this, like I said, there's probably an easier, more efficient way of doing this that we could look at. However, this was simple for me to see a long list of these things that are being excluded and encapsulated so that we're not including them in the conversational part. And so any cases of this and that small segment between punctuation, and it goes inside the capsules. So here was the logic. This took me some time to develop, but I wanted to grab the context a little bit right at the beginning of the conversation, a little bit afterwards, to see if it really is the end of the conversation. So once again, I looked for anything to start a quote. If it doesn't have a quote, I created that flag, no, it has no quote. And then I said, if it has this and it has this, so that means we have a conversation and the line after it, then we start creating a text. And I ended up with originally about 20,000 texts because they were really short. And so we'd see one line and then a big paragraph. I decided that's not, it doesn't represent, I can't compare that to the spoken corpora that I have. And I'm really looking at conversations that have some sort of exchange, that have multiple interlocutors. And so I set, and I had to play with this value, but I set it at 8,000 characters. Anything below 8,000 characters got rejected and no text file was created. I went up to 10,000 and I had too few. I went down to 5,000 and some of them were really, really short. So it was kind of a process of trial and error to get what seemed like a comparable amount of text to compare against the other register that I had, but also that represented chunks of conversation in this literature. So once again, these nested loops for each book, we're looking at each paragraph. Within each paragraph, we're looking at each phrase. Within each phrase, we're looking for certain things and encapsulating them off so we don't consider them, including other things. And once again, the result was about 600 texts from 17 of these. So a lot of them didn't meet the qualifications for any inclusion, but under 1 million words. So I had a challenge I had to consider. Did I want to match the number of words, or did I want to match closer the number of texts? And this is kind of what I chose to go with. And the result of that is I had to norm across all of my results so I could compare from one register to the other. So in essence of kind of in an effort to address some questions that there might be about the methods, I'm going to pause for a second and look at some of the questions about specifically about Python and the corpora, and then I'll talk about my results. So I see, let's see what happens if I click this. Okay. So the spoken corpora are 2 corpora that are publicly available, the 𝗃𝗏 and the 𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗏. The corpus 𝗃𝗏 de français parlé parisien is the most commonly used in emerging descriptive work, corpus work in French. And so I hope that addresses your question. The 𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗏 has its own website that has a lot of information about it. So you can take a look at that. I can share those links with you at the end. Pablo asks, what makes Python better than other corpus readers such as ant_conc or wordsmith tools for lexical bundle analysis? Python is infinitely scriptable and modifiable. However, you have to have some experience in programming. And so if you can use ant_conc and wordsmith, I don't see why there's any problems, especially with the regular expressions. You can really accomplish a lot. To build a corpus, I think, is a little bit different, especially because I had these texts and I knew I needed to process kind of individual chunks of these texts. I went with Python more through talking with other people who had done similar things, not necessarily because I thought it was the best. I'm sure there are lots of other ways to accomplish something similar. So once again, I'm not a Python expert, but this was what worked for me, and I think it worked quite well in the end. Maria Jose Avoconi asked, easy to understand material about Python, something for beginners. I wish I knew. I know there are lots of guides on YouTube to get started. There are definitely tutorials out there to get an idea of how to use this with texts in particular. And there are websites such as Stack Exchange, where if you have a question, you can Google it and really quickly find an answer. Within the PyCharm suite, software suite, there are a few extra tools that help you. If there's an error, it'll usually identify it before you even attempt to run the script. So there's hopefully that kind of answers your question about at least how to get started. I think, at least for me, it's good to have a purpose. It's hard to go learn something if you don't have learn a tool if you don't have a purpose for it. However, if you know what you'd like to accomplish and you think Python might be a good fit, I think it's probably easier to work through it that way. I hope that helps. The IDE, I believe this is referring to the suite 𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗃. 𝗵𝗀𝗃 CE is a freely available open source one. It's nicely kind of contained on a Mac, where it doesn't interact with any other part of the system. You don't have to install anything extra. My understanding is with Windows, you have to install Python. You can install Python separately, and then they kind of interact, and some strange things can happen. But lots of people use it on both Windows and Mac. So 𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗃 is the name. I can maybe open it up at the end of the session today if we have time. Which library do I use to tag my corpus is the last question. I'll look at this in a minute here when we get to research question 2. I use 𝗃𝗽𝗃𝗪, and I actually didn't use the scripted version. I used it out of Lanxbox. So yeah. How did I keep, this is a good question, and I didn't cover this. How did I keep track of the origin of each quote? I did this through the file name. And so when I set up in the code to write out to a specific file, I included the original text file plus the iteration of that, and then I included some other things as well in the text file name. And so that kind of extra meta information can be really helpful. Of course, because it's infinitely scriptable in Python, you could add all sorts of information in the tag, the opening tag, and header information of your text file. So it'd be really easy to add that into a text file as well. What did I try before using Python? This was already almost a year ago. I don't remember trying really anything else at this point in time. I think I'd kind of learned that Python was really good at text manipulation, and particularly at string manipulation. Regular expressions were really too easy to incorporate. So I kind of chose with it and decided to force my project into Python rather than really do wide research and look at other options. I'm sure there's lots of other things out there that can do a good job. Did I try R? I did not try R. I've come to understand that R has a lot of options as well in terms of text, and I think 𝗪𝗪 Egbert has said that R and Python are becoming more and more similar throughout the years, and so I think that would be another option, a really interesting option to explore, especially if you know you're going to use statistical analyses on your output somehow. Okay, I think that's all of the questions for now. So let me show some of the results, and then we should have some time at the end for a few more questions. Okay, so to look at the results of, to look at the linguistic features here, getting back to my original research questions, I first attempted to create a list of all the possible variants of il y a and c'est. There's 15 tenses times 8 adverbs of negation, and use a Python script to search for each variant. And it didn't work very well. This was part of the trial and error. And part of that is a couple of things that happen in French. And that is, negation is usually done through 2 parts. We have ce n'est pas is the official textbook version. However, it's rarely said. And so c'est pas, and how it's transcribed in the spoken corpora, is much more common. And so I had to also double basically all of the search terms in order to find this. I didn't want to use a tagged version of the corpora yet to look for a lemmatized version, because I really wanted to capture all of these features. So to go between the lemmatized and the textual form, I thought it was better just to look for the textual form. Il n'y a plus que, also in que, we can have elision here, so kind of a contraction, and have apostrophe. And we have some adverbs of negation that have gender morphology as well. So lots of different things to go on here. And so I ended up using a system of manual searching in ant conc, because I saw the results. I could triple check for any additional variants. And then I set a minimum frequency of 2 and a minimum dispersion of 2 before I would capture the number of results and record those in Excel. This took time because it was over 260 queries, but I really think it was valuable to look at all of these results, not necessarily one by one, but at least in one aggregate form per query, and get an idea of what's common, what's happening here. Once it was in Excel, I normed to 100,000 words. And then I coded those based on the type, right? Because I've got a fixed number of tenses and fixed number of adverbs of negation for tense and time negation, and then if there was an adverb, which adverb was used. Just to give you an idea of the morphological complexity available to these expressions, for these expressions in French, we can see 2 present tenses met the threshold requirements, 2 past tenses, conditional, and 2 future tenses met this as well. And once again, this is only within the conversational components. There's a separate literary past tense that didn't meet the inclusion requirement because following what we think about what we're told about this is it's rarely used in spoken form. And then for the adverbs of negation, we have a number of forms such as none or not one, jamais, personne, plus que, and rien. And it's also possible to stack these. And so we have "Il n'y avait plus personne au château," which is from the _Histoire de la Magie, and there's no longer anyone in the castle. So we can stack these on top of each other as well, which is why the manual searches were really revealing to see what was happening and how often it was happening. So looking at some of the results, I wanted to look, first of all, the overall frequency across the 2 registers, the spoken and then the spoken as represented in literature, the negation, adverbs of negation, and tense. So seems to be a lot more common than il y a in both. Let's kind of dive into this a little bit. Part of this is looks like it's being used as filler and often repeated. So we have the example of "C'est vraiment correct, c'est vraiment un voyage, c'est adorable maintenant 𝗪𝗡". So we have this as just kind of a repeated form here. In terms of the literary form, we don't see that as much, which is to be expected considering it's written down, even though it's a representation of conversation. It's still refined to a bit, and so there might be other techniques used to show kind of pauses or fillers and those sorts of things. So, for example, we have these really well thought out sentences, these really well thought out conversational pieces. This is from the Count of Monte Cristo, and I really like this one. So it's if I could die, I would go where he goes. I would certainly find him, but how to die? And then someone else adds, "C'est bien facile, 𝗟𝗘𝗃𝗟 𝗪𝗂". So it's a nice little example of "c'est." We have a lot of text here before we get to the "c'est" in this case, and this was the only instance of "c'est" in this entire text, if I remember correctly. Looking at the negation, we see a lot more positive than negative, to be expected, nothing surprising here. However, I think this is really representing those repeated forms. And so we see this here, and then the negated ones are potentially also repeated, but not as much. Looking at "c'est" and "il y a". Looking at the adverbs of negation, this was good news for me as a language teacher in that pas, which is the basic root form of negation as a not, was the most common. And that these other ones, these adverbs of negation, which can be quite tricky to use and teach, are more rare across all genres. And so that's, I think, slightly positive news to come out of this. If we break it out between 𝗟𝗍𝗪 and the two registers, we still see the vast majority of these instances just use 𝗏 for negation. Kind of diving into a couple of these exceptions, though, we have something a little bit different using que, which is only, the adverb negation that would be the equivalent of only in English. Il n'y a que le pape qui soit infaillible. There's only the Pope who's infallible. This is one of those cleft constructions. I thought it was a nice example to look at one of those. And there's never been a true secret that you told someone. Once again, we have some sort of interesting construction here. So looking particularly at idia, I wanted to show a few examples of that. Looking at tense, more good news for our learners, and that is there's a lot of present tense here. And the imparfait, which is morphologically easier for learners. However, it tends to get taught later in the syllabus. And so between these two, we see kind of a strong tendency for present tense. That means, starting with this and really working through it is beneficial, hopefully, for our learners in accessing this type of speech. Some examples here. So I mentioned at the very beginning that idia can be used as an existential or as a time marker. And so here's a nice peaceful example for us today. Do you remember what we were ruminating about 3 months ago? This ago is idia, present tense. In the small garden, on the beach, on the bench, in the sun, under the jasmine. So this is the temporal sense, and then il y a trois copines et il y a un garçon. So here we have trois, we have three in both examples, but completely different functions. Okay, so looking at research question 2, the context around these two sequences, really just what follows them in these texts. I loaded the entire corpus into Lanxbox in order to access the tree tagger. However, since then I found it's quite to do through scripting, so it could be done easily through Python or other scripts. And parse the scripts into Excel columns so that I could sort and count what these different tags were. And so just to remind you kind of the information given to learners as they're first looking at these expressions, we see a lot of these indefinite articles coming here, more indefinite articles. This one's a question, of course. Well, in reality, what follows these for idia, starting with idia, is incredibly complex. And so we had 16 of the tree tagger tags had over 100 occurrences. We see something else to kind of represent the diversity is 12 tags were less than 10% of the total for each of these, for idia, for each of these registers. Starting at the top a little bit, we see prepositions. So this makes sense. This is grammatical, and it kind of gets presented inductively, implicitly throughout the textbook. So it's not too much of a stretch to ask learners to really kind of understand these. We have determiners, and one of the interesting things is that the feminine determiner floated over towards the QFFL side, the literary side, whereas the masculine was very much right in the middle. I think this has to do with how 𝗟 can be used as filler, and 𝗟𝗃 would be kind of a filler before someone has fully kind of thought of the noun that they want to use. They might prefer a masculine noun. So this kind of opens up a psycholinguistic question about what's following this, and is there a preference for a gender of a determiner when there's not a fully kind of prepared noun for that sentence? Something to look at in the future. However, in the book, it says after this, you almost always follow with an indefinite determiner. Le, les, and la, the definite article here, it also shows up quite a bit. And so we see here another one of our cleft constructions. In this case, il y a le stade qui est ouvert. This is normal, natural conversation. And one of the nice parts about this corpus actually tells you the person's name. And they're from the 7th arrondissement in Paris. So we can learn a lot about the individuals here as well. Trying to tease apart the function of il y a between the temporal marker, the time marker, and the existential, I thought maybe we could look at numbers. And it turns out that wasn't the case. The numbers really didn't lead us lead me to any kind of concrete definition of it being temporal or existential. So here are a couple of examples. My plane comes from farther back. We could say I was 4 years ago a 40-year-old man with 500,000 francs. And so il y a 4 ans. And once again, we have il y a 4. And in this case, this is a nice little example. If you work like me, you're obligated to go there on the weekends when there are 400 tons of people, right? So we have the same number, we have the same really context around it, but two completely different purposes. So this is not immediately apparent in the context around this, of which one we're talking about. And adverbs make sense as well because they would normally go right after the verb phrase in French. And so, yeah, this makes sense. Some of these are adverbs of negation as well. Looking at a couple of examples, we do see one exception to that, and that is quand même, which is an idiomatic phrase, which is like still or even though. It's kind of becoming dispreferred. It's not viewed as polite or fancy speech anymore. So, but it's still really, really common, and much more so, interestingly, in the literary side than the spoken side. So that was kind of an interesting and unexpected finding. And then our negation here is another example of a more complex sequence after the negation. And finally, let's look at the context of 𝗍, it is, or there is. Looking at, once again, our textbook says you almost always follow with a determiner, or you can maybe have an adverb. Once again, we have a ton of diversity of what happens after this. 21 tags had over 100 occurrences. 12 tags were less than 10% of what followed. We see determiners here quite a bit more than we saw with il y a. However, we do see c'est un. Here's an example of what I was referring to before, that filler speech with a masculine indefinite article. And here we have adjectives, which makes sense. They can just be stacked on before nouns, even though technically there should be a determiner between them. So it's interesting to see how that can be kind of violated in certain cases, and adverbs as well, which makes sense. Okay, so what does this all mean? The good news is that il y a and 𝗍 most commonly exist in the present tense and within both registers, and negation is commonly done in the most basic form with 𝗏. And that's, I think, good news for spoken register for language learners. There's a lot of variety in the use of il y a and 𝗍 in terms of what follows it, a lot more than what's really talked about in pedagogical texts. And really a lot beyond cleft constructions as well, although we do see quite a few of those. The functions of il y a are not apparent really syntactically with the immediate context. We have to go beyond that to really understand what it's talking about. And numerous textbook descriptions are violated, especially in the context of how these expressions are used. Of course, one of the limitations of these two registers, these two corpora to compare is one's old, one's new, one's spoken, one's, well, someone's idea of spoken language. And so that is a bit of a confound. However, I think there's still two interesting registers that are commonly represented for learners. Balancing the corpora might change the results. So I chose to balance on number of texts versus size, and then use a norming process. It might be different with a different balancing approach. There are additional forms of this that I didn't have a chance to look at here, and that's question constructions, where anything can happen. We have special inversion forms of these words, and those are often not used in spoken form. So this would be an interesting thing to look at kind of as a separate project. And then diving deeper into the functions of these, I think, would also be really, really interesting. So I'll leave you, and we'll have questions and answers after this, but thinking about the relationship between what we know about describing these expressions and what we see in our pedagogical texts. I have this kind of final comment. Avez-vous jamais vu une révolte, maître Jacques? J'en ai fait, dit le chaussure. Comment faites-vous, dit le roi, pour faire une révolte? Ah, répondit 𝗵𝗱𝗄, ce n'est pas bien difficile, il y a 100 façons. So I'm calling for a revolution, of course, in the way we approach these, and hopefully represent more of the diversity of how these things appear in spoken language in particular. Thank you so much.